I've been involved in both the Tibetan Buddhist world and the world of Western psychology, in particular Jung, for the last 40 plus years, I suppose. I met them both at the same time when I was at university, going through something of an identity crisis. I was very much at the early stages of Westerners encountering the Tibetan tradition, and so I got it in its raw and rather undiluted form, which wasn't always very easy, I have to say. But I needed something to bring it into my Western experience, and Jung was very, very helpful in that. I went into retreat in India for about 5 years, and when I came back to the West, realised I was completely unemployable, basically. So I wanted to find some way of bringing that into my Western life, and clearly the most valuable way of doing that was to become a psychotherapist. I have a growing mentoring practice with people all over the world that are struggling actually with Buddhism and how to bring it into their life. You know, that world is more to do with helping Buddhists integrate Buddhism into their life, really, in terms of our psychological needs. And that's mostly what I do these days. So that's where I am. So I'm going to try and bring together some of the threads that have come up, elements of an Eastern tradition that are particularly relevant to us, perhaps, in the West today. So I want to actually speak from the place of being very much, for the sake of today's kind of discussion, very much a Tibetan Buddhist who has become, who has dived into it fairly intensively. I could probably say I was a bit of a fundamentalist for a while, but maybe that was necessary before I finally broke free. But what it has meant is that over the last, as I say, 40 years, my journey has been very much one of going into huge amount of depth in the Tibetan tradition, much against Jung's approval, I'm sure. Because as you said, you know, Jung may not have seen this as being a valid journey for me as a Westerner. But I think one of the things I would say in counter to one of Jung's comments is that, yes, it's true, I've been born in this life into a Western body, into a Western context, but the continuity of my consciousness isn't just a Westerner. You know, if you like, my experience of previous life is that I wasn't in the West in a previous life. Okay, in this life, we can really see that we've been born into Western culture, and we're steeped in Western culture and Western psychological process. But many of us have a continuity that has come into this life that's come from somewhere else. So we could say we're Westerns in this life, but where does the continuity of our consciousness come from? You know, maybe it wasn't in the West in previous life. Just a thought. What felt very significant for me in encountering the Tibetan tradition was that I think I entered into it with a view that this would resolve a lot of my own psychological, emotional life issues and problems. As I then began to go more and more deeply into it and practice very intensively the Tibetan tradition, one of the things that began to be more apparent to me was that hoping that it was always going to address my psychological issues was something of an error. You know, I was assuming somewhere that my Eastern teachers would have a clear understanding of my Western psychological needs, emotional needs, and so I had huge faith in and trust in their capacity to teach me and to guide me, with the assumption that they knew what I needed, actually. And I think over the years I began to see that whilst they did have something quite extraordinary to teach me, there were many ways in which my expectations or my hopes about what they could provide were actually missing something. And I think what became clear fairly early on was that many of my Tibetan teachers that had been connected to Westerners were quite shocked at the degree of our psychological and emotional wounding. That for them, growing up in a relatively unpressurized context, you know, where the culture had certain ingredients that weren't so stressful emotionally, psychologically, they didn't experience the same kind of issues that we have as Westerners, or that I had as a Westerner. And so I think as I began to study some of the really fundamental principles and texts and practices of the Tibetan tradition, I gained a huge amount of knowledge about these systems and practices and the philosophy and so on. But what I began to feel was that it was not addressing something fundamental in my nature. And I went through quite a phase of being quite disappointed by this. And often I would go to certain Tibetans and say, well, how do I deal with the depression that I go into sometimes? Or how do I deal with certain levels of anxiety or some emotional difficulties that I have? And they would give me answers that were, you know, from one point of view, were very clear and concise and had a certain logic to them, but it didn't change something. It somehow or other it didn't meet something I needed. And this became quite a struggle, I think. And it was only gradually over a number of years that I began to see that if I started to explore the practices that I was learning and some of the meditation approaches that I was learning and found those that really connected to me, then there were resources there that I could use to resolve some of my emotional, psychological stuff. But it wasn't immediately obvious. As a teacher of Tibetan Buddhism and working in mentoring with people that are very genuinely and sincerely wanting to practice an Eastern tradition, not just bringing elements of it into a kind of secular life, which is a little bit like mindfulness, but who actually want to embark upon the Tibetan Buddhist world, is that I'm increasingly contacted by people who have perhaps done 3-year retreats, for example, and are coming out of it realizing they haven't addressed any of their psychological problems. They've gone deeply into certain practices, particularly tantric practices, and they may have stirred up certain issues that have been necessary to find ways of working with, but then when they've gone to their Tibetan teachers are at a bit of a loss to actually know how to deal with it. So the only way that they've quite often been able to resolve that is to find someone who's bridging worlds, if you like. And I mean, I happen to be accessible, and I guess for me that's been my journey so much, of bridging those worlds. And so I'm often contacted by people that have done long practice, many years of practice, long retreats, who are saying, so how do I deal with my emotional life? And I find that fascinating, because it says to me that you know, we have this unbelievable resource of an Eastern tradition, and many of us want to draw it into our life, but it requires a lot more skill and understanding psychologically to actually be able to do so. In the West, we are very motivated, shall we say, by our feelings and emotions. You know, they're really central to us, actually. And they, you know, whether it's positive feelings like, you know, compassion, kindness, and so on, or whether it's uncomfortable feelings, emotions, they move us, they motivate us in our life. They are often the kind of aspects of our nature that are so fundamental to who we are and how we live. And I think myself and many of my peers in the Tibetan Buddhist world have assumed that when we talk about emotions and feelings, that Tibetans, for example, will understand what we're talking about. And I think the thing that has grown in my own awareness of this is that actually they don't. In Buddhism, the words that are often translated into Western language are often translated as delusion or emotional affliction and this kind of language. but it's not the same as our experience of feeling and emotion. So if I go and talk to a Tibetan about my feelings and emotions, they will kind of put that into a frame of understanding that's different to ours. So we miss somewhere. The other thing is that actually in living amongst Tibetans for many years, what became increasingly apparent to me was that when I did talk about my feeling and emotional life, it was as though they didn't quite comprehend how that was in my experience, because they don't experience it the same way. And I was really puzzled by this, because I thought, well, surely we're human, we all have the same experiences on some level. And yet I think it's begun to be apparent to me that the way Tibetans do feelings and emotions is different to us. I think they're incredibly different, actually. I've never seen a Tibetan express their feelings. Yeah, never. And that may sound bizarre, and that doesn't mean to say they don't feel, but they don't seem to consider it to be of any significance. Yeah. And when I hear them talking about emotions, they tend to put emotion and feeling all into the same box as that which is the cause of suffering. Yeah. And that somehow or other we need to cleanse it, heal it, purify it, contain it, do something to it so that it doesn't dominate our life. Now, me hearing that as a Westerner puts me in a real conflict, because my feelings and emotions are such an important part of who I am. And yet I'm getting this message that in order to become a good Buddhist, in inverted commas, I have to eradicate that side of my nature. Very, very confusing, actually. And then, actually, recently, I was reading a Snowline magazine. There's a newspaper that the publisher that publishes my books sends out. It's called the Snowline magazine. And I was reading an article in there by a very famous Tibetan Lama, Tibetan talker. And he was saying that, effectively he was saying that in the West, being in touch with our feelings was doing us more harm than good. And I just thought, yeah, okay, that sort of fits something that I've been puzzled about. You know, all my life I've been trying, as a man from England, trying to get in touch with my feelings. Being very British, you know. So I've been trying to learn how to be with my feelings and understand my feeling life and my emotional life, and to be able to language it, communicate it, relate to others through it, and especially, you know, my wife is very in relationship to her feeling life, and I need to be the same. So, you know, as a man in the West, that was a really important part of my growing up, if you like, was to get in touch with my feelings. And growing up through the 60s and 70s, it was the big message, oh, you're not in touch with your feelings. Then I get this message, or I see this article where this Tibetan is saying, the trouble with you in the West is that your relationship to your feelings is actually not doing you any good. And I thought, what's going on here? And I think what I would say is that it's a really clear indication for me of how, while I may go to the East and I want to bring an Eastern tradition into my life, I cannot assume that those that teach me from the East will understand where I'm coming from. And I thought that they did, and I trusted that they did, and this isn't a criticism of them, because I love them dearly and I appreciate what they bring, but it's really saying, why should I expect them to? They don't have our psychological background, they don't have our emotional wounding and all the stresses that we grew up with, and they don't relate to their feeling and emotional life in the same way that we do in the West. And yet, they also have practices that, if I can use them skillfully, are an incredible resource for my relationship to my emotion and feeling life. But somehow or other we need to know how to use them skillfully and to draw aspects of it that can actually transform us. Maybe something that is worth bringing in at this moment is a bit of a link to what you were saying about Jung's view of psyche, of the psyche. And I suppose I would say that I began to recognize or see in my constant bridging of these two worlds, in my practice and in my work, that we could say that the Buddhist and particularly the Tantric view of the psyche and the Jungian view of the psyche, although they look similar, are actually incredibly different. And the difference is that, and correct me if you feel this isn't a skillful way of putting it, but the feeling I get is that Jung's view of the psyche is a structure of the psyche, where his particular attention is on the contents of that structure. So the contents of the personal unconscious, the contents of the collective unconscious. Yeah? And there's a sense of it being structured in a particular way. Now, that view works really well psychologically for an awful lot of the experiences that we have. Things come through from the unconscious, and we need to integrate them in some way in order that our relationship to what's in the unconscious becomes more whole and integrated. One could also say that the reason Jung had this sense that if we try to meditate we would go unconscious effectively is based on the same map. If I use that map, then if I'm sitting there, ego on the surface, beginning to meditate, I'm going to drop into the unconscious by definition. I go unconscious. You know, it makes complete sense with that map. Now, having been a meditator for 40 years and having gone to some fairly, sometimes excruciatingly uncomfortable places, and at other times quite kind of pleasant places, I didn't lose my awareness. Something was retained in that process, and I didn't just go unconscious. And it makes sense that that should be the case if I put a different flavour to that map. So if I was to describe the same map that Jung has in a subtly different way, then we have our consciousness as a present quality of an awareness of the duality of experience, me and phenomena. And then as we drop down, that begins to become more subtle, so that we move into what we might consider to be more subtle dimensions of awareness, which are part of being present still. So we're present and aware, but becoming more subtle. So we begin to move into the domain that Jung would call the personal conscious, but we're doing so not as a structural process, a structural thing, but as a process. So we're dipping into the moment-to-moment arising of the experience of more subtle levels of our inner life. The metaphor that I think is quite useful is the metaphor of the ocean, if you like. At first we're in all these waves on the surface being, you know, washed around, buffeted around by a lot of things that are coming from underneath. Then as we begin to meditate, we drop down into just beneath the surface, and we're still being washed around by emotional processes and so on, but with a quality of awareness that is largely around mindfulness. As we go deeper, we start to touch into some of those more profound undercurrents that affect our life, that we could frame as archetypal intent, archetypal processes that are moving us on deeper and deeper levels. Yeah? And that becomes a more direct experience of that, rather than something that we know about because they pop up to the surface. Yeah? So we're actually beginning to move like a submariner, you know, slowly settling down into the ocean. And apparently submariners talk about this. They say that as a submarine goes right to the depth of the ocean, they experience what's known as the clear element, which is the depth of the ocean where there's no movement and it's completely still. I guess the difference is that it's pitch black as well, which, you know, whereas as a meditator it doesn't become pitch black, something else happens. As we drop deeper and move through those undercurrents, those oceanic currents, at some point we can settle into a place which is pristine, clear, still, luminous and vast, because that's the intrinsic nature of our mind. So whereas the submariner goes into pitch black, what we do in a sense is we go into total clarity and awareness. And we could say that that's the place of real awakeness, whereas what Jung would call consciousness is actually the place of complete asleepness. Yeah? The whole map is upside down. Yeah? So in my daily life, I could say I'm conscious of the dualistic experiences that I have, but I'm profoundly unaware of those deeper levels. So I'm kind of asleep to it. Now, as a meditator, as we begin to descend through those layers, what we're doing is waking up to the underlying nature of reality. Yeah, the pristine clarity of awareness that opens to the nature of reality. So we've got this peculiar inversion, and it means that if we can see the psyche as a deepening process of subtlety in the present, then actually the mindfulness practice is like a little tiny tip of the iceberg. You know, and I think one of the things that often both fascinates me but also rather disappoints me in a way is that the mindfulness practice has been brought into a secular context, which is completely valid because it sharpens our capacity to witness our processes, to witness our experiences. But it's as though we're touching the top of something, which if it was understood the depth of that iceberg, there is some unbelievable potential as we go deeper and deeper and deeper. I have lots of peers and friends and people that I supervise in England around their teaching as mindfulness teachers. And one of the things that I think is interesting to hear is that whilst they've recognized that the compassionate element needs to be present, the other thing that they're beginning to see is that if someone is really good at it, you know, someone can really do the meditation, then actually something begins to happen which is a bit tricky. Because what can then start to happen is that the stability of the ordinary sense of self starts to unravel. Now for some people that's fine, but for people who have quite strong dispositions to unravel anyway, it's actually more harmful. You know, so unless mindfulness teachers have an understanding of the potential of what can happen as we go deeper, then it's actually quite hazardous, I think. So I think, for me, the practice of Mahamudra, which is the background that I have in terms of Tibetan tradition, is a profound way of practice that the Tibetans offer us, that if we bring it into our Western life, has huge implications, actually, and can take us deeper and deeper and deeper without avoiding our psychological stuff. You know, the hazard of becoming so involved in Eastern tradition practices is that we can put a veneer of practice of all these exotic tantric practices and God knows what onto our consciousness, onto our mind, and miss all of that psychological process that needs to happen as well. And that's the danger, really. Now with Mahamudra and this way of working with the deepening of awareness, that doesn't have to happen, actually. Another element which hasn't been mentioned, and I want to bring it in, is that I think for many of us in the West, we have a fairly natural resonance with we might use the word energy. It's a word that we overuse, isn't it? You know, well, it's all about energy, isn't it? Right? But I think coming from the Tantra tradition, and that's my primary background, then one of the things that became very clear to me in my own deepening of practice was that as my awareness deepened in meditation, the other thing that also became increasingly apparent was an increasingly subtle relationship to the process of energy, to the experience of energy in my body, and alongside that, the energetic resonance with the environment. You know, as we deepen in meditation and open that sensitivity, what we begin to do is to open a sensitivity to an awful lot of what's going on around us that we hadn't previously noticed. Give you an example of it. You come into this room today, and you probably weren't very aware necessarily, very much, of the energetic state of everyone else in the room. You might have a general sense of, oh, it's nice here, it's a good feeling, but I'm a little bit anxious and I'm not sure what's going to happen. So we have some energetic sense of what it's like to be here. Now, if any of you have the capacity to go more sensitized through meditation, then what you start to pick up is, oh, I see, it's interesting what's going on over there, over there. There's a broader field of process going on at the same time. Yeah. Now, if we relate to that as an energetic process rather than an emotional process, what we're doing is we're constantly picking up the environment, picking up how others are. We may not notice it very much until it becomes quite gross, quite strong, but it's there. Now, as a therapist, I think one of the most useful aspects of the therapeutic process for me was as I would sit and just connect into how I am and go into a slightly more subtle place of present awareness. What I'm also doing is beginning to really pick up how someone else is. Yeah? Because we resonate with it on certain levels. And that gives us a huge access, gradually, to understanding how a person's experience is arising. And I'm not talking about magical thinking, or it doesn't have to be anything particularly exotic. It's just about being more sensitized to how we are, and then how others are. And we could come back to the Jungian sense of how that becomes valuable, in that as I allow myself to connect into that, one of the ways it speaks to me is through metaphor, through symbol. So I might be working with someone therapeutically, and rather than getting caught up in lots of dialogue and discussion, which is useful, but instead coming back to that place of just sitting with how it feels to be here, and that sense of compassionate presence, tuning into something a little bit more subtly, and then I'll start to get information out of that. Maybe some image comes for what it's like to be here. And if I can introduce that image into the therapeutic space, there's a kind of unraveling of something quite often that has quite profound implications to it. I don't know, does that sound like nonsense?
No, not at all.
I think the other, okay, let's put another bit of the picture in. And that is, there's three men sitting here. Why is that? I don't know. I think in terms of the way the Tibetan tradition in particular has come to the West, it's come from a very masculine, very patriarchal history. And I think being a man that is only half man, if you like, I've got this other half which is called my feminine side. One of the things that I've often found quite difficult is that the relationship between that tradition and my feminine side, and also I've noticed this with a lot of women, I think a lot of women find it difficult to actually be so overloaded with a very patriarchal system, and how that impacts us is not easy actually. And so one of the things that has become more and more crucial, it feels to me, in terms of working with Westerners who are trying to be involved in this Eastern tradition, and many of them being women, is that the whole thing needs to be reshaped, reflavoured, whatever we care to call it, in order that it actually meets the individual's needs and the individual's disposition. And what I think has happened historically over the past probably 25 years, 30 years, that the Tibetans have been particularly full on coming to the West and teaching Westerners, is that many of us, and women included, have taken on the practices, and then wonder why a few years down the road they've lost relationship to something in themselves, which is their own innate, natural, intuitive wisdom. It's as though it's got overlaid by something. And also maybe that real resonance with the felt process. These two things can get overwhelmed by the power of the authority of the tradition. And so, both for my own practice, but also in terms of how I would then want to support others with their practice and their relationship to the Tibetan tradition, it's really felt important to bring out, if you like, the feminine in it, to put it in that language, to somehow or other find the way in which that responds to a different nature, you know, and that becomes more sensitive to how our own psychological process needs to unfold. Yeah. So instead of imposing a tradition on my psyche, actually listening to what I need and seeing how I can draw on that tradition to help it unfold, help it individuate, help it emerge. Yeah, so that's felt to be a really necessary way of bringing worlds together, actually. And I know that sitting here saying that, there will be aspects of the Tibetan tradition that would say, "Oh, you can't do that. You know, you can't be creative around this stuff, or you can't change the tradition." Well, personally, it feels to me as though if we don't allow it to change, it will die. It won't become our experience. It will just overlay our experience. And that will mean it doesn't really become true and authentic for us. You know? And as I say, I think I'm speaking in a slightly different position to these two gentlemen here, in that I'm speaking very much as a Tibetan Buddhist, trying to bring it into my life and actually draw into that my understanding of Western psychology in order to integrate it. Because I think if we can do that, then the dialogue that goes on doesn't just inform Western psychology and elements of that. It also means that the Tibetan tradition can really come alive in the West as our experience. And I would hesitate to even call myself a Tibetan Buddhist then. When Buddhism and the Tantra tradition particularly went from India to Tibet, the Tibetans did a number on it. They shaped it, they coloured it, they flavoured it, they turned it into Tibetan Buddhism. And one of the things that the Tibetans love doing is composing wonderful practices, poetic liturgy, verses of visualizations and prayers and all this. It's their thing. They love it, you know. I don't think that's the way the Indians practiced it, necessarily. So what we get as Tibetan tradition in the West today is their complete reflavouring of it. But if I see it that way, then there's something about trying to find the essence of that and seeing how that comes through our experience as Westerners. And it may mean we let things open out a bit, and I feel very grateful to my primary teacher, Lama Yeshe, who was the founder of the organisation that this centre is part of, who was an incredibly creative Tibetan teacher, and actually was willing to break all the rules and to be and to kind of enrich the process creatively for us to be able to access it. So he felt to be the most extraordinary model of something which actually I felt I wanted to continue, really, you know, as a Western Tibetan Buddhist. And who knows where that's going to evolve to. You know, I think these worlds of Western psychology and Buddhism, Western philosophy and the Tibetan tradition, Western science and the Tibetan tradition, they keep meeting, and every time they meet there's this extraordinary whatever it is, steam arises, you know, steam. They start to cook, and as they cook, new things emerge. So there's lots of cooking going on, and I'm very happy to be part of that. I guess part of my struggle was that as one of the Westerners that met the Tibetan in their raw Tibetan nature 40 years ago, part of my job has been to try and deal with what they gave me that was very traditional and to bring it into my experience. I suppose what's come out of that is that if I can begin to pass that on as a Westerner, and that can be worked with in a different way. You don't have to necessarily go back to the original roots of it in order to get benefit from the process of it. So we'll see where it goes. And more elements will be brought into the psychological world gradually. More aspects of the psychological world will be brought into the Tibetan tradition. And I think it's a really rich dialogue that's going on. I'll stop.
In Burma, Myanmar, I have become very, very unhappy about alleged Buddhist persecutions and killings of the Muslim minority of Rohingya. It's just incomprehensible if there's any truth to this. Do any of you have a comment?
Unfortunately, Buddhism is practiced by human beings. And that would be the short answer. I mean, the history of religion, not just Buddhism, but all kinds of religions, are full of terrible atrocities committed in the name of religion.
Yeah.
Just think about the Christian Crusades.
Oh,
And Buddhism, unfortunately, has had its share of problems. For example, during the Second World War, some very renowned Japanese Zen masters supported the war and wrote some terrible things about the Jews and the necessity of exterminating them, and explaining that as a good Buddhist it was your duty to support the emperor and destroy everything that hindered the rise of the Dharma.
One of the hazards of Tibetans coming to the West is that they are also, many of them, very human as well. Even though we may have fantasies about them being, you know, enlightened beings or whatever, the danger is of getting caught in that idealized fantasy around them. And when I was in Dharamsala a couple of years back, the Dalai Lama made a comment about he was worried about the cult of the tulku in the West. I don't know whether you're familiar with the idea. Tulkus are supposedly highly evolved incarnate lamas. They're described as being seen almost as Buddhas, but they're not Buddhas necessarily. They may have very deep realizations, but they still make mistakes, they still get it wrong, they still have their flaws, and sometimes they can be quite abusive because of that. You know, so I think another aspect of us in the West is not to hold illusions around perfection, around Eastern masters and teachers, you know, and not to be kind of caught up in a spiritual correctness that assumes that we've got rid of our shadow.
There have been reports of people who began to meditate and got some anxiety or delved into depressive process. So combining psychotherapy and meditation, your experience as a psychotherapist, what can one do if one as a therapist begin a process of meditation with one's client and then the client gets one of those symptoms?
There are certain dangers connected with meditation, as you mentioned. Say in order to transcend your ego, you need to have an ego, and if you don't have a stable foundation, if you are, say, if you're disposed for a psychotic breakdown, in very great cases, or if you have a borderline condition and you start to practice meditation, it might be dangerous. You might further a pathological process. Fortunately, it's very rarely that it's so serious, but there are certain dangers connected with deep meditational practices, which we in the West again tend to overlook because we have this very idealistic notion of, oh, you just sit down and practice meditation and then all your problems are solved. That's one of the reasons I think what we have all been saying and what this conference is about, that it's important to combine the two traditions, the two approaches, that you can certainly not solve your personal problems by practicing meditation, but it's very good to combine those two approaches, because meditation might and often will bring up personal problems when you try to empty your mind. All sorts of things come up.
So what would you do in such a concrete situation? You know,
If a client
reports anxiety.
anxiety.
Yeah, anxiety. Yeah.
The first thing I would look at was whether this anxiety came from a specific source or whether it was what you call general floating anxiety. And if it was severe anxiety, I think I would recommend the client to stop practicing meditation for a while until he or she and we had discovered what was the reason of this anxiety, what are the roots of it. Is it something serious, or is it something that could easily be dealt with?
Can I put another angle into the picture as well? And that is that if we were to see meditation as part of an alchemical cooking process, you know, then it can often be that, especially if we can support and hold someone as they do their practice, then we could say that things like anxiety or depression arising is actually a natural part of the process, you know, and that if I can support that and actually sustain a holding of them through that journey, then actually something's going to change. And I say that very much from the point where, while I was in retreat myself, I went through incredibly deep periods of depression. Yeah, I mean, meditation is not all about bliss, you know. So I used to go through sometimes 2 or 3 months of intense depression that from the outside world would look like clinical depression or something. But actually what was happening is that there was a whole transformational process going on, that by staying with it, I was dying basically on one level. You know, there was a kind of death, descent, dark night of the soul kind of process going on. That if I can sustain an understanding of the process of that, then there can also be a re-emergence. So I wouldn't automatically assume that these symptoms, if you like, coming up are necessarily a bad thing. They can be part of the process. Yeah. So I think it's a case of trying to assess which direction something is going in.
I agree completely, but you have to be very clear on what's going on here. What's the reason of this anxiety? How much ego strength does this person have? Can you cope with it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I've had this kind of experiences too, but not as deep as yours. But I've experienced this terrible kind of anxiety too during deep meditation. And if you can keep your focus, then it can be very beneficial. But I've had clients too who had deep anxiety experiences, who couldn't cope with them, and where I felt that they shouldn't go deeper because that would be too dangerous. So you can't, I don't think you can't give a general advice, and of course that's what I'm saying, you can't say go ahead with it or don't go ahead with it. It depends on the problem and severity and ego strength.
Thank you, that was helpful.
I would like to add that maybe one could also reflect on what you mean by meditation. I mean, and you know, there are so many exercises you can do. For example, if we're not talking depression, but more like people that are spacing out in some sort, there's all kinds of walking meditations where you sort of feel your feet and you know, all these grounding kind of exercises. These kind of practices can be very helpful in sort of connecting to parts of the body that some of the people I work with, when they are in very spacey states of mind, they actually lose contact with some people can't feel their legs and their feet, and then it can be helpful to reconnect to the legs and the earth and stuff like that. And then sometimes we tend to think very negatively of depression, like in our culture it's better to be extroverted and
depression is bad.
And depression is bad. But I agree that both psychotherapy and meditation can be sort of deepening processes, and you can also look at some things that look like depression as sort of deepening and sort of withdrawal within oneself, and that I agree that at some level you have to allow it to happen, I think, in a psychotherapy process.
I think it's really interesting that in a way we're, and I can see this from the discussion we're having here, that we're having to learn how to utilize many different facets of meditation in the most appropriate way in different circumstances. And like you say, we can draw on these as useful resources to bring them in at different times in different contexts. So we need to have quite a broad spectrum of an understanding of different styles of practice, different styles of meditation, not just one only. You know. And the body work is a really important part of that.
There seem to be very specific boxes that we tend to put things into. Buddhists put it into more boxes. Psychotherapists have boxes that they put it into. And the problem is to open up this flow between the one and the other, get out of the boxes. So I heard somebody talk about crazy wisdom on the Buddhist tradition. It's this middle way of qualified teachers that do this seem to bridge this whole. That's the place to go, huh?
Shall I respond to that? I think we've got a very tricky ground when we start to talk about that, because rather like I was saying about the Tibetan High Lamas that come to the West, the assumption that we make is that their ordinary identity in the world has a certain kind of integrity to it and a certain quality to it that is going to mean that whatever they do for us is going to be beneficial. So if they're doing crazy things, of course it's beneficial to us because they're enlightened beings and they're simply manifesting craziness for my sake. And we need to balance that with, actually some of them may be very unstable, you know, and that their identity process is actually a bit flawed, and they're doing stuff which is potentially really hazardous for us, and I'm not discerning that. Instead I'm saying, oh yeah, of course you can do that. Crazy wisdom. And it's not, and it can be quite abusive.
I can perhaps give you an example. It's a very good point. You know Trungpa, Trungpa, yes. He wrote this Tibetan Tulku, wrote several books, cutting through the spiritual materialism, for example. Trungpa was a chain smoker, heavily drinker, and he showed himself publicly with his mistresses, many mistresses, and he was a married man. And then he died for a heart failure caused by his heavy drinking and smoking. Before he died, he appointed his Dharma successor. This Dharma successor always died from AIDS, but before he died from AIDS, he had sex, unprotected sex with many of his disciples, which also contracted AIDS. And some of Trungpa's followers still praise his crazy wisdom. So that's an example of the dark side of the crazy wisdom.
And the difficulty is, how do we know?
Exactly.
And I think this comes back to something that we were talking about, some of you were here yesterday, that somewhere or other we need to learn to trust our own feeling about this. Does this feel appropriate or does it not? You know, and actually listen to that. And then if we feel something's not appropriate, to voice it, rather than, yes, I should just accept it because he's the guru, sort of thing. And the Dalai Lama once said that we ruin our gurus by never questioning them, by never challenging them. You know, and so they can get away with everything. So I think the crazy wisdom thing is quite a tricky territory.
I would like to ask a little bit of clarification maybe on the self thing. I heard that Jung then has a lot of 6 different explanations for the self, and within Buddhism you often hear that through introspection you should try and look for yourself and you will find out that there is no self. Within phenomenology, as I have understood it, they at least differs between the narrative self the story about yourself, I am this person and that, and also the pre-reflective self, that when you experience something, when you have any conscious act, somewhat within it, it has a sense of self, like I'm not in doubt that I am the one speaking right now. So in the act, I have a sense of self. My question is, the self that we through introspection should kind of see that we don't have, what type of self is that? Like the narrative, or is it also the pre-reflexive?
As you say, there are many different notions of the self. I think you could write books, thick books about the way that one uses the expression self in psychology, psychiatry, philosophy. When you turn your attention inwards and try to, as I said during my lecture, and try to find out who's talking now, you don't find a fixed entity. If you look more closely, you will notice ever-shifting, never-ending line of sense impressions. Sometimes in deep meditations, I've had the experience of my mental processes slowing very much down. So I was seeing, just seeing, then I was hearing, just hearing, then I was feeling my body, just feeling my body. Like a film moving very slowly, and gave me a basic understanding. I've read of these things, but I've never experienced before. It gave me a basic understanding of what is this self, this thing that we call self. It's a shifting, a lot of shifting sense impressions, and usually they change so fast that we feel it like a whole. Buddha used the example of if you take a candle or a burning stick and move it fast around, and it's dark, it looks like there is a circle, but actually there's not a circle. That's the kind of self you experience when you start to look inward. And because of habitual thinking, you have the feeling that this is myself. And of course it becomes different if you start to look more closely and meditate deeper on the question. In Zen there's a sutra that's saying you realize that true self is no self. And then of course a very tricky question is, okay, if there's no self, then what is it that experiences these things? Who or what is talking? And that's something that can't be expressed in words. You have to experience it. Roshi, the former abbot in the monastery where I trained, he used the picture of an ocean with waves, and he said that each wave is like a person, and each wave feels individual, but actually all the waves are connected to the ocean below. And if you meditate for many years, meditate very, very hard, then you can experience that ocean. But yeah, it's not something you can put in words.
Can I add a little bit to that? I think that's great. I think one of the things that has always felt to be significant in that for me, in terms of how I might experience that, is that it becomes possible to distinguish, in a sense, two selves, if you like. One that is a functioning, as you know, I'm sitting here talking, and that relative sense of self functions as a self. And the other one is a self which, when you said as though it's what we think of it, actually it's more to me what I feel is a kind of contracted me that becomes very much more solid sense of contraction into a sense of me, and that often has with it lots of emotional beliefs and wounds. So when I contract into that sense of me, it will often bring with it quite an emotional charge, like I'm not good enough, or I'm not this, or, you know, lots of negative, quite often stuff about that emotional sense of it. And the Tibetans use the word ego grasping, or daksin, which is what needs to be kind of cut through. It's the contracting and solidifying a sense of me around something which actually isn't truly there. So it's actually empty, but what I've done is I've contracted into it. We can feel it. You know, if someone pushes one of my buttons, like, You said that to me. You know, that vivid sense of contraction. And if I can gradually soften and loosen that, then there's more space. There's more possibility to move, to shift. There's more fluidity. And that doesn't change the relative me sitting there talking.
A big part of what creates problems is our relationship to our emotions, not being able to contain them, being scared of whatever comes up, even anxiety or anger or whatever it is. And so, well, as a therapist, I thought a lot about how I, as a therapist, or anyone as a therapist, relate to what comes up with the other person. If I get scared, then I might actually be obstructing the personal process of the person, because maybe the anxiety is what would you describe as when there is an ego and it can actually take you places. But what happens if the therapist actually gets scared of the feelings and then goes, oh, don't go there, and then the personal process might never evolve, and they'll say, oh, I should never go there again.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, good point. That's one of the reasons why it's a requirement for being a Jungian therapist or psychoanalyst, for that matter, that you have to undergo training yourself, you have to undergo analysis yourself, just to avoid that you get caught up in your own personal problems. That might still happen, but it minimizes the risk.
I think there's the other side of that, which, you know, speaking from the Buddhist world specifically as well, that there are an awful lot of ways in which Buddhists and Buddhist practitioners are given the message that those feelings are not appropriate. And so they tend to get pushed into the shadow. And I mean, I've been involved in many different Buddhist organizations where that's kind of become the culture. You know, that emotions and feelings are the source of suffering, and therefore we have to push them down.
I remember in this monastery where I trained, he was a kind of monk actually, and he sort of boasted up his level of liberation, and it showed up in his relationship to women. He said he could always leave a woman, and he'd done that many times. And he took that as a proof of his deep spiritual attainment. He didn't get involved with his feelings. It didn't mean anything to him. Yes, no attachment.
In regard to mindfulness, there's a certain notion in the West where apparently, as you said, it's severed from spirituality. And assume as all these CEOs and directors are sitting and doing that, and suddenly an elevator shaft opens up vertically to something. I think mindfulness can be used as a kind of euphoric soma, as a sedative in a brave new world where the tyrannical structures are so imminent. One should actually more rebel in a sense. So what I'm asking is, how is the modern bodhisattvic approach to political enlightened action?
You can work on many levels. You can work on the political level and to change the world, and you can work on the individual level. I think both levels are important. In order to change the world, to make the world a better place, you have to change yourself, of course. And you also have to try to influence others, to influence the way that things develop. How you do that politically is a huge question. I must be honest and say I don't know if I knew how to change the world politically. I would do it. The best I feel I can do is by being a good example for others, changing myself and trying to be a good example for others. I don't work politically. I have deep respect for people who do that. I don't do it myself, but I think it's important.
Then, for example, the pollen of Monsanto's fields would still blow in our direction and contaminate our land. So maybe mindfulness can be a remedy, but it's only symptomatic treatment as far as we're not aware of that GMO could be destructive. Maybe.
According to Buddhism, all things are connected. I am you and you are me. We haven't realized it yet, but that's the way it is. So I have heard deeply enlightened people say that when you reach a very deep level of spiritual maturity, you actually influence other people too. I don't know whether it's true, but those of you who have participated in group meditation have probably sometimes experienced that, as Rob talked about, this intuition, the field, this energy field, that you are part of something bigger, that you're connected to something. So to me, it makes sense that by working at yourself, you're actually not just working at yourself, you're working at something collective, something bigger.
I would like to bring this ethical perspective more to the foreground, and I think in that sense that's also bridges to the political initiative. And I'm also reminded of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I was seeing a video where there was this woman who she was saying something like, "I lost a child. I have so much emotional pain in me. Can't you give me some advice? How can I overcome it? How can I be happy and like you?" And then he replied something like that she should go out and help others. Mm-hmm. She had all kind of opportunities to go out and help others, and that was his recommendation. And she was sort of baffled, and she expected some sort of technique that could help her pain or something like that, but he sort of recommended like giving something, doing something in the world, and sort of doing as a practice, like turning her attention to others and giving it, and maybe that would relieve her pain. But I don't know if that was an answer, but that was definitely, I think, an ethical perspective on what meditation and spiritual practice is.
I think also that it was a part of the intention of meeting today, that at some way this meeting between the East and West are influencing society. And I see the West as more extroverted, more oriented towards structure, and the East as more introverted, looking inside. So you could say that the meeting between East and West is also a meeting between a socially engaged way of being, but also that stems from a ground within. So I think that it would also be a way of seeing the meeting.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we'll stop here and say thank you to all of you two first for coming and sharing. Please, thank you to all of you for coming and participating. It's really good to see you, and I hope to see you again in the future soon.